Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. Tonight we have some true horror stories for you about dogmen and werewolves. So enjoy and don't forget to like, share and subscribe. 2009. It was the end of summer. Before school started, my mum and I took a last-minute weekend trip to see my grandparents. I used to say that my grandparents lived in the middle of nowhere. I was a teenager at the time, and being out in the woods wasn't really my thing. All I could do was sit around the kitchen and talk with my mother and grandmother, or hang out with my grandfather in his woodworking shop. He liked to tinker with wood and make things like bulls, tables and chairs, which he sometimes sold at local swap meets. When we got to their house, my mum went inside, and I went to the wood shop to find my dad. I went in and sure enough, he was working on something I'd never seen him make before. He was leaning forward and carving a bust out of a piece of wood, but it didn't look like a human head. He was making a carving of an animal that had long hair all over its head. After a while of watching him, I finally asked him what he was making. He looked me in the eyes and asked, "Have you ever heard of a dog man?" I slowly shook my head no, and thought for a moment. What does he mean? It sounded like a creature from a fairy tale. Like, was it a man or a dog? He put the piece of wood on the ground and asked me to sit with him. He said he wanted to talk to me about something now that I was old enough to understand. The story he was about to tell me took place in 1984, 25 years ago. Long before I was born, he saw a creature that he thinks lives in the woods near their house, but he can't prove it. He still thinks about it every day. In October 1984, he was working on building the wood shop. At the time, he did everything by himself, including cutting the wood and making plans. Back then, he still had a job and had to build a lot at night and on weekends during the summer. This was fine in the summer when the sun set late, but the days were getting shorter and shorter in the fall. One evening, he worked a little longer than usual because he forgot how quickly the sun was setting. By the time he started to clean up and bring his tools inside for the night, it was already dark. As he was putting them all away, he realized he couldn't find his axe anywhere. He looked everywhere outside the garage door before realizing that he must have left it in the woods where he had just cut down a tree. Now, you have to understand that my dad is very careful. If something wasn't in its right place in his garage, he wouldn't be able to sleep. Did he know that another thing was about to happen that would make it hard for him to sleep for years? He took a flashlight and went into the woods to look for the axe. He was not scared at all and knew those woods like the back of his hand, but he did say something about that night. Just didn't feel right. As he walked back toward the country, he had the strange feeling that he wasn't alone. He kept hearing a low rumbling sound that made him stop and listen. Every time he stopped, the noise stopped, and every time he started again, the noise did too. He said it sounded like a deep breath or a low growl. It was a sound he had never heard before in his life. When he finally got to the tree, the axe was still stuck in the stump, just waiting for him to grab it. He was thrilled. I'm glad I found it. He quickly grabbed it and turned around to go home before his grandmother worried about him. He turned the flashlight around and took one step toward home. Then, he saw a creature whose looks shocked him and stopped him in his tracks. This huge creature stood in his way on the way back to the house. It was covered in dark hair and was very thin and muscular. It looked like a man with the face of a dog and was standing on its two back legs. They just stood there and looked at each other. With the flashlight shining on him and a dog-like creature staring down at him with glowing amber eyes, my grandfather said that all he could think about was the drool coming out of the creature's mouth, and he was sure he was going to die. As soon as they met, the human-dog thing ran off into the woods, howling like a person screaming. Grandpa listened to the terrifying howls until they were quiet enough to ignore. He thought it was safe to keep going back home. When he finally got there, his grandmother was upset and trying to figure out what had happened to him. He told her that he had gone to get the axe and lost his way in the dark woods. She could tell by the way he looked at her. It was because of something else that he had not, in fact, lost his way. Also, she knew from that day in the wood shop that he knew those woods like the back of his hand. He told me that he never told his grandmother what he had seen, and that I was the first person to hear the story in 25 years. But he still thought about that thing every day, so he never went back into the woods at night and never again forgot his tools. He gave me the carved bust, which I can now see was this dogman creature. He told me to never forget what lives in the woods and to always be aware of what's going on around us. I know you might all think I'm crazy, and that maybe I didn't see what I thought I did, or that it was late at night and I was making things up. But my mum didn't raise me to be stupid, and I know what I saw. I could see it plain as day. Nobody can change my mind. I've been working at the drive-thru at night for about a year. I hadn't seen anything stranger than a few strange people trying to order at the drive-thru window as if they didn't know they were in their cars. Those are the kinds of problems I can deal with. But this was something different. I was standing at the counter and looking out the window that day. From that window, I could see the highway on one side and woods on the other. I was just looking around and thinking about things when I heard this strange sound coming from the edge of the woods. During these very late night shifts, there isn't a single person around, let alone a customer. The only reason the manager keeps the place open is because of a franchise obligation and a certain number of open hours. I'm not sure, but the truth is that no one is going to Beaver's at 4 a.m. for a Big D Daddy Burger, period. Even though the manager knows this, he or she gets us to work this shift because it pays double time and we usually don't have to do much work. Seriously, the guys I work with cook up about a dozen burgers at the start of their shift and put them in the steamer. Then they sit on cardboard boxes and play poker all night. If someone does come through to buy a burger, they get one that is about as fresh as they are at this time of night. Just like every other night, the guys were in the back with their cards and I was working the drive-thru counter. During the day, there are 2 windows open. The first one is where people place their orders, and the second is the servant hatch, where their food is brought to them. Both jobs are me I'd take the order, and then go to the serving hatch to give the food to the person who asked for it. Most nights, though, no one orders, so I don't have to leave the order counter. So, I got my own chair and a charger for my phone, so I could watch TV that night. I'd forgotten my phone charger. So I was reading a bad book I found in the storeroom, and just staring out the window, not thinking about much. That's when I heard the noise. It sounded like something moving around in the woods right next to the road, across from the drive-thru window. My first thought was that it might be raccoons, because they sometimes come around looking for food in the trash, and if they spill it, guess whose job it is to clean it up? I leaned out of the booth over the edge and into the space under the glass to see if I could get a better look at where this strange sound was coming from. I also had to check the trash cans, hoping they were still standing. At first, I didn't see anything, so I was about to tell those little raccoons to get lost when I saw a shadow on the parking lot. I know that when light is behind you, it can really stretch out your shadow and make you look really tall or whatever, but that's not what happened here. When I saw that shadow, I knew right away that something was wrong. When I tell people what I saw, they sometimes say it was probably just a drunk guy in a wolf costume or a punk kid playing a joke, which is fine. But if that's true, he must have been a basketball player, or he must have been standing on stilts. I mean, the shadow it cast was at least 7 feet tall, and then I saw this thing. I watched it slowly make its way out of the woods. At first it was hunched over like a dog or maybe a bear, but then it just stood up, not like a bear does. This wasn't an animal trying to stay upright on its back legs. It stood up as if it was used to walking like a person, on 2 legs. But it was obvious it wasn't a man. Some people told me it could have been a Sasquatch, a UFO, or aliens, but it looked more like a werewolf. I know that sounds crazy, but that's how it looks, with its snout or muzzle or whatever you want to call it sticking out. They looked like these teeth, which had 2 rows of sharp teeth and a lot of hair all over. It had been long and looked very dirty. I wanted to scream to tell the guys in the back, but I was afraid that if I made a sound, it would turn around and see me looking at it, and there was only a small piece of plexiglass between me and the outside of that drive-thru window. Even worse, the glass doesn't go all the way down. Some people think it's reinforced or bulletproof, like at McDonald's or Wendy's, but this is just regular glass. I kept imagining that thing breaking through the wall and coming at me. It didn't have paws for hands. I'm talking about hands that look like human hands, but the fingers are longer and the tips have big black claws. I was just thinking about them breaking through the glass and grabbing me when it stopped moving and raised its head as if it could smell something, tasting it and looking for a scent. I just knew in that moment that I had to get out of there and move before it saw me, so I slowly moved away from the window with tiny steps, never taking my eyes off of it. As soon as my hand reached the door, I pulled the fire alarm, and sirens and high-pitched wailing filled the room. I just screamed and turned around. When the guys in the back ran outside to look, it was gone. All that was left was an empty parking lot and some dark trees in the highway. I knew the guys wouldn't believe me, and that's fine with me. You may not believe me right now, but what I'm saying is true. I'll tell you something else. That is correct. That was the last time I worked a night shift, and it will also be the last time I work a night shift anywhere else. I don't know what it was, and I don't really want to find out. I hope you like what I told you. I'd always hated Fuller's Wood, and if I hadn't had my dogs with me, I probably still would have. I would never be anywhere near them that late at night. On my way home from college, I used to have to walk through the woods. But they scare me so much that I eventually got off the bus one stop later and walked back the long way. I mean, at least those paths in the woods had streetlights. Half the time you couldn't see where you were going or who was with you. I mean, everything is possible. I only went back into the woods because I had to. About 2 semesters ago, I started college. I was really getting low on money. I had a job during the summer before, but it ended when school started. Since then, I hadn't worked. I asked around among my friends to find out what was going on. One of them said they could walk the dog. I know it sounds crazy, but most of the time I really liked it. I've always liked animals, and the dogs in our neighborhood are pretty good, with the exception of 1 or 2 that get a little rowdy sometimes. At least the ones I had to work with were pretty much what the job sounds like. You go to the house of someone who isn't home and can't take their dogs out as often as they'd like at a certain time every day. You go to a few homes and get the dogs' leashes. Then you take a bunch of dogs for a walk, making sure they get good exercise anyway. In a busy place, you can't let the dogs run free. One might run out into the street or something. Someone could even drive into them. But the real trick is to find some open land or woods where you can let them off the leash and let them run around. I started going back into the woods again because of this. This gave the dog room to run around, and I didn't think much was going to happen to me if I had 6 dogs with me at the time. In fact, until that night, I didn't feel scared at all going in there as long as these dogs were with me. But now, I won't go in there ever again. So that night, I go into the woods and let the dogs off their leashes. Most of the time, they stay close and just play and jump all over each other. Do what dogs do and sniff each other out, but something went wrong. It's strange because you think that only loud sounds and noises, like when a balloon pops or a car backfires, would get your attention. But the same thing happens when there are no sounds, when it is quiet. You notice things like when a sound should be there, but isn't, and all of a sudden you become very aware of everything. I had the same thing happen to me. The dogs ran ahead, but after a minute or 2, I stopped hearing them, which is strange. Anyone who has had a dog will tell you that they aren't really animals. When there are several dogs together, they are always barking, yipping, or doing something else. But all of a sudden, it was like they were no longer there. All of a sudden, no one spoke. At this point, I was getting a little scared, so I walked with a little more care. Then, when I turned a corner, I saw them all at once. They were all lying on their backs in the middle of the path. When they do this, their bellies show, and they are quiet. It's not just because they want a belly rub, it's a sign of submission, like when the weaker dogs do it in front of the pack leaders or alpha male. Start with wolves, it's the same thing. I was curious about what they were doing, but then I saw what they were doing. It wasn't a dog, and it wasn't a person either. It was something different. I think that shouldn't be, like it shouldn't exist or be allowed to exist. It seems wrong in a weird way. I thought it looked stretched, like it had been pulled or pushed too hard when it was made for almost a whole minute. I just stood there frozen in place. My legs just don't want to move. I did nothing but stand there and watch. It came out of the trees on one side of the path and into the clearing. It walked like a man with long steps and stood up on 2 legs, but they weren't man's legs at all. At the joints, they had a funny backwards arch, like a dog's leg or a horse's hind legs. The way the muscles under the head moved showed that it wasn't made like a dog either. It had a lot of muscles and was very strong. Its muscles looked like knots of cable. You could tell that with one snap, it could release all of its energy and rip or tear apart anything it wanted. I took everything in. I was afraid to stay still, afraid to move, and didn't know what to do until it looked at me more than anything else. I remember that its head was huge and muscled. It looked like a dog's head, with erect ears and sharp angles, but it was huge. I thought of a big predator like a lion or leopard because of its size and shape. As it turned toward me, it looked like the whole thing was made to hunt. I saw that it had yellow eyes that were just fixed on me, like it was judging me or getting a feel for me. I thought they were smarter than any dog you'd ever seen. There was something mean about it, like it knew it was looking at me, knew I had seen it, and knew I couldn't get away from it. I saw its head go down, and then all of the dogs started to bark at once, louder and closer. I looked from its eyes to its teeth, which hung down like stalactites and shot forwards. And I ran as fast as I could towards the open roads, dragging the dog's leash behind me. We were all pushing with everything we had. We had to get back to the road, where there was a light and safety, and everyone knew that if it chased me, if this thing decided to come after me because it thought I was food, I was dead. Not at all. I never saw it again, in fact. Now, when I get off the bus, I go home a completely different way. One that gets me as far away from Fuller's Woods as possible. It's scary there. And if you ever get close to where I live, do yourself a favor and stay away. It just doesn't pay off. If you happen to run into whatever this thing was about 6 months ago, here's what to do. I took up jogging. I have a job that doesn't require me to move around much, and after I turned 30, I really started to put on weight. I decided that I had to do something. I tried running on the treadmill at the gym, but I didn't like it. So I went outside to look for places. Where I lived in northwestern Ohio, there weren't many established trails, but a co-worker suggested a rural area just outside of town. It was a small area of woods with a few old logging roads and not much else. It was farther away than I'd planned to go, but I decided to check it out one day. The roads were rough on my car, but my co-worker was right. It was perfect for what I wanted, and I had the whole place to myself. I never saw anybody else. It was a quiet run with trees on both sides of the road. After that, I started going for shorter runs around my neighborhood a few times a week and 2 longer runs on the weekends. When I ran around my neighborhood, I usually wore headphones and listened to Spotify. But when I ran in the woods, I didn't wear headphones because the sounds of the forest were soothing. Just the sound of birds and leaves rustling in the wind. One Saturday, I went for my usual run, but something didn't feel quite right. It took me a while to figure out what was different, but after about a mile, I noticed how strangely quiet it was. There were no birds making any noise. The only sound I could hear was the wind. I stopped running and looked around to try to figure out what was wrong, but nothing was going on. No cars or other machines were making noise. It was cloudy, but I couldn't see any signs of a storm coming. I couldn't figure it out, but I'm not a zoologist either. So I thought it might be because of something normal, like migration season. Feeling vaguely unsettled, I got back to running. On my longer runs, I had worked up to 6 miles, and I still had 5 miles to go, or about an hour and 2 more miles into the woods. I would then turn around and go back to get my car. The next 2 miles went by without a hitch, but I couldn't get rid of that strange feeling. At first, I thought the creepy feeling was because there were no animal sounds. But as time went on, I began to feel something else. It felt like someone was watching me out there with me. I'm not a paranoid person. I take the usual precautions, like wearing reflective gear and carrying my phone with me at all times, but that's pretty much all. But as I ran, I was mad at myself for not having brought anything. Even a small pocket knife or pepper spray. I stopped running twice and did a very slow 360 turn to look into the woods to see if anyone was watching me, but I didn't see anything. I ran faster to get back to my car as quickly as I could. Now I'm only 2 miles away and can get there in less than 20 minutes. I was ready to get out of the woods, which made me mad because this was usually my favorite time of the week. As I got to the last mile, I finally saw something move in the woods. It was coming toward me. I stopped running again and took a few steps toward the trees. I was nervous and tried to be ready in case it was a bear or something else that could kill me. I saw it move between the trees, but I still can't make out any details. When I could see better, I was able to calm down. It was big and stood up straight. I wasn't sure if I should start running again or stop and say hello to the person. It was strange that he was alone and out in the woods, away from the road. He could have been hiking, watching birds, or working for a logging company. As he got closer, I thought I saw a few strange things. He looked like he was wearing a furry hat, or had wild hair and beard that couldn't be tamed. I could only see a big hair on his head, and he walked with an odd limp. Then I got goosebumps all over my body. I thought he was wearing colours that didn't stand out. So I couldn't see any bright clothes. And when he got within 100 yards, I realised he wasn't even wearing clothes. He was hairy and naked. Now I was completely scared. Out in the woods, there was a naked, crazy man. Maybe a homeless person or a mountain man who lives alone. I didn't know, but I knew I didn't want to talk to him or hang out with him. I started running, trying to get back to my car before he could catch me. I took a few looks back. I ran, but I didn't see him. Then I heard this horrible screech that sounded like a cross between a scream and a howl a wolf would make. I turned back to where the sound was coming from and saw the man or figure again. He was now very close. He must have been running through the woods as fast as I was, which I didn't think was possible as I watched. He raised his head, and that was the first time I saw his face. It wasn't a beard or long hair, it was clearly fur, and his face wasn't human. It was the face of a dog, kind of like a German shepherd, and while his body was human-shaped, his head wasn't. He looked at me with the most intense, sharpest eyes, and then opened his mouth and made that awful sound again. It snapped me out of the trance I was in, and I ran as fast as I could. I knew I wasn't far away, and I really wanted to get to my car. I literally dove into my car, and as I pulled away, I felt like my lungs were going to burst. I tried to figure out what I had just seen as I drove away. Maybe it was an animal or something from a story. I didn't know. I didn't tell any of my friends about it until much later. And since they were from Michigan, they said it sounds like a dogman. What do you know about this man-dog thing? On September 10, 2013, the following things happened in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. I watched from the window as my father drove away from the house and down the street. I was finally by myself, and I had the house to myself all weekend. It was a cool Friday in the fall. The sky was full of stars, and it looked so beautiful and made me feel warm. My boyfriend and I had planned to go hiking that weekend, and we were leaving that day. I looked at the time and saw that it was getting late and that he could be there at any time. So I ran to the kitchen and packed a few days' worth of food, some clothes, and a book to keep me busy in my backpack. After waiting for him for 45 minutes, he finally showed up. I locked the door and we went to the pine forest just outside my house. We kept going on our trip even though the giant pines were beautiful and the wind was fierce. It took us 3 hours to walk the path that led to the deepest part of the forest. The view was a beautiful sight. We decided to set up our tent here because there was a big pine tree there, and it seemed like a good place to spend the night. We put up the tent and tried to do our chores on our own. After I finished unpacking, I got out some of the food I brought with me. We ate, and there was a lot of quiet. I wasn't even aware of how hungry I was. After eating, the food was gone almost right away. We decided to take a carbon nap, but I didn't want to sleep, so I took my book out of the tent, sat under a big pine tree, and got lost in a great book. I read for hours, and then it got a little chilly, but I couldn't put the book down. So I went into the tent and continued to read. I don't remember when I was sleeping because I was still reading the book in my dreams. Later, I woke up to find that the tent was freezing cold, so I got out of bed and put on a cardigan. I then unzipped the tent and went to the bathroom. The moon was already bright and friendly looking. It was just right. Even the stars in the sky seemed to be saying hello to me. They sparkled, and being outside made me feel like I was in heaven. It's impossible to explain. I was about to walk into the tent when I heard footsteps. I stopped moving. Were we being watched, or was it just the wind? I thought I had looked around very carefully, but I didn't find anything. Even the steps stopped. I could only hear the wind howling and the big trees being blown around. I thought I was just making things up. So I went into the tent, laid down, and tried to sleep. I jumped on the air mattress right away. This time, I heard it again, much clearer. I thought that if I woke up my boyfriend, he might wake up too. So I woke him up, but he was too deep in his dream to wake up. He did not budge. Then I thought that there were probably other campers in the forest, like us enjoying the weekend. I ruled it as an important, closed my eyes to continue my beauty sleep. It seemed like the stranger never wanted me to continue sleeping because not up to 5 minutes of my own lane. I heard a loud howl. It sounded kind of like a wolf, but also did not sound like one. I wasn't too sure what kind of animal would make such a noise at all if it was a howl and not to cry. So I sat up, waited to see if I would hear it again. And it did, sure enough. The sound came this time, much closer to the tent. Now I became scared and tried waking my boyfriend, but he still would not budge until today. I wonder how he could have slept through the noise and not heard a single thing. I picked a bat we brought along for the trip in case of an emergency, then went to the door of the tent. I unzipped it a little to know if I could see the animal. Lo and behold, it stood facing the tent. I was incredibly startled and made a sound. This got its attention, this animal, and it turned its eyes on me. I almost wet my pants. What animal is this? I wondered. It stood about 9 feet tall, taller than the tent, with its hunched back and really long body. What caught my attention was that it wasn't a wolf, but a dog. A strange-looking dog that closely resembled a Doberman Pinscher. Under the moonlight, I could see its bare teeth, and it had a messy black fur all over its body with what appeared to be a large mane around its neck, just like a lion does if its fur was kind of clean and shiny and even glistened silver in the light of the moon. I would have turned it beautiful, but seeing it in this mangy state, I was scared. The beast never moved from its position. It just stood watching me. So I took a few steps back and its eyes followed my every movement. It had a set of eyes I've never seen in any animal. These yellow amber eyes that glowed up even in the dark, like when headlights hit a deer's eyes, kind of like that, but they were more natural, and they were always emitting a glow. I turned, determined to be on the safe side, hit my boyfriend with the bat to wake him up. He did. He got angry that I hit him. But when he saw that I wasn't responding and looked pale, he quickly concluded something was wrong. So he asked me to tell him why I was in this state. I drew his attention to the tent door to show him, but this thing was already gone. The only traces of the animal or its footprints on the wet soil. This experience shook me. I can no longer sleep nor think straight. When morning came, we packed our tent, our belongings and everything we had and went back home highly on the bed that day, thinking of this animal creature with glowing eyes. It made me realize that some things exist in this world which we do not know, and know I have no idea to this day what it is, that I saw once a month or so. I drive over an hour away to a nearby town to visit my grandparents. They live in a retirement home. My family meets there for a special dinner on Sunday afternoons. I was close to them growing up, and I rarely ever missed a dinner. Sometimes I would bring my boyfriend, but mostly I went by myself Sunday in November. We stayed late talking. Normally I would have left by 5 or 6 p.m, trying to get back at a reasonable time so I'd be rested for work the next day. But that night I didn't leave until around 7:30, which was well after dark for that time of the year. Having just been daylight savings time for whatever reason, I made a stupid decision with the route I chose to take home. There were 2 options for getting back to my house from there, the main highway or a small country road. I often switched back and forth and choosing between the 2 depending on whether I was in a hurry or the weather. The back road was a nice drive. It passed through forests and farms. It was also full of potholes, not to mention dangerous in weather that wasn't exactly permissible. That night I had automatically started driving that way just on autopilot. Not thinking it was late dark in prime deer season, I would have to drive slowly and cautiously. I was familiar with the road at least, so I wasn't too worried several times as I was driving though. I thought I saw deer. Luckily they were off the road though, and did not try to jump out in front of me. I got into the most heavily forested section of the drive. It was pitch black in there, no streetlights or house lights anywhere. Just my headlights. I slowed a little more and concentrated on the road. It was much harder to see anything off to the sides, so if a deer were on the edge of the road, I wouldn't see it until the last minute. Then of course it happened. Something ran just inside the arc of my headlights. It ran so fast that I could not see it clearly. 1, 2, it was there and then it was gone. A minute later I saw it again. Another quick flash just off to my left. I kept my eye on it ready to slam on my brakes if I needed to, assuming it was going to be a large animal. The craziest thing happened then. I saw the flash of brown, but instead of darting back into the woods, it leaped. It jumped across almost the entire road in a single leap. It had launched from the side of the road in the small ditch and landed nearly in front of my oncoming vehicle on the other side of my car. It did in fact slam on the brakes, swearing up a storm. I know deer can jump far, but not like that. I had not seen it clearly when it jumped, but when it landed in front of me, and I could see that it landed on 2 legs, not 4. It had landed like a person, a human being, and then vanished into the woods. It happened so fast, and it was a dark silhouette. I began to doubt what I saw, but it did not look like any animal that I had ever remember seeing before. I did not start driving again right away. I wanted to make sure that it was really gone first, so I watched my window looking for more movement. When it happened, I was not prepared because I was looking the wrong way. Either there were 2 of them, or it had gotten behind me somehow and doubled back. Either way, it came from the same side again, launching 15 ft into the air. This time it did not land in the road. It landed on the hood of my car. The entire vehicle shook and rocked with the impact. I yelled, grabbing onto the steering wheel tightly. I could see its legs and feet, the windshield as it landed. They were very muscular. They looked mostly like a human in shape, although they were more bent above the knee, and the feet were longer than a human and had claws. They actually kind of looked like a mix between a canine's feet and a human-only being on my hood for a quick second, then jumping away. I had no idea what I'd just seen, and I did not care to stick around and find out. I started my car again after momentarily shutting off from the impact, my knuckles white as I clenched the steering wheel. I was still watching for this animal, but I figured faster was better at that point. I was almost out of the forest when it ran in front of my car again. I swerved into the other lane and hit the brakes. I came to a stop diagonally across the lanes. This animal had stopped on the other side of the road, so this time it was right in front of my range of my headlights. I can see the rest of it now. So clearly its chest was massive. It had overly long arms and a huge head, to think like a lion's head with how big it was. It actually resembled more of a hyena than anything else, with some humanoid features. It was really ugly and had these large fangs sticking into the top part of its mouth, and it stared at me. I stared back then. Just as fast as it showed up, it vanished into the trees. I took off, getting back into my lane and speeding out of the forest. Once I was out of the trees, I didn't see it again. I got home alive, called my girlfriend, and told her what had happened. She thought I was joking and asked how much I had to drink when she realized that I was serious. She insisted that it had just been a deer, and I was clearly seeing things. Although I told her about the claws and the way the face looked, she said it could have been a stray dog or maybe a large coyote. She didn't really believe me. I guess I can't blame her. The next morning, when I walked out to my car and there were large claw marks dug into the hood of my car, I know what I saw, and my girlfriend still would not believe me, I guess. I just don't tell the story to anyone, or maybe a few slug people. Hopefully you won't think I'm crazy. I mean, the only thing I can think of is this was indeed a dogman. I've heard of them growing up, but I never ever thought I would encounter one myself.